Episode 30. This woman is very feisty. "Don't push me," Natalie said angrily. Liam, who was sitting next to his mom, was also furious. Last time, this nasty auntie had bullied him and his mother, and now she was looking for trouble again. He felt very angry, so he immediately stood up and kicked Cheryl's leg.
"You are a bad woman. I won't allow you to bully my mommy."
Cheryl had not expected him to kick her. She immediately scolded him. "You little brat, I'll teach you a lesson." She raised her hand to hit him, but Natalie quickly stopped her and slapped her in the face. "What right do you have to discipline my son? Get lost." The slap was hard and caused Cheryl's face to turn red. Her entire life, no one had ever dared to lay a hand on her. She cried to Nick, "Oh, she slapped me. I only wanted to discipline Liam, but she slapped me." Seeing that Cheryl was being bullied, Nick's face darkened. He said coldly, "Natalie, that was too much. Apologize to Cheryl right now." "You're asking me to apologize to her?" "Don't be ridiculous." She wouldn't budge. She felt disgusted just looking at Nick's face. Nick saw that she was being stubborn, and he felt a bit awkward. "Natalie, the reason I'm still talking to you so patiently is because of our past relationship. Don't push your luck." She found this amusing and raised her eyebrows in disdain. "When did I ask you to do that? You'd better stay away from me and get out of my sight." He saw the disgust in her eyes and knew he had hit a nerve. He understood that this Natalie was no longer the woman who had loved him so dearly. He was furious. He angrily grabbed her collar. "You really think I won't hit you?" Liam saw his mom being threatened and cried out,
"If you hurt my mom, my dad won't let you get away with it."
When Cheryl heard that, she snickered. "Your dad? Bryce Clare? He's not even your father. Just because he's rich, you can't go around calling him dad. Who knows where you came from? You're just a bastard." Although Liam didn't understand all the words, he knew that Cheryl was mocking him for not having a father. He stood there in a daze, really hurt. Natalie instantly became angry and defensive. Liam was the most important person in her life. He had never been scolded like this. Didn't Cheryl realize how much damage she was doing by saying those words to a child? She was so enraged that she pushed Nick away, picked up a steak knife from the table, and held it against Cheryl's neck. With bloodshot eyes, she said, "I dare you to say that one more time." The scene immediately descended into chaos. Cheryl hadn't expected her sister to do such a thing, especially when she looked so fragile. For a moment, she didn't dare to react. Meanwhile, at the other end of the restaurant, Bryce was watching the scene unfold. He had come in to eat with some friends, but he heard a commotion, and when he looked over, he had seen the mother and child again. His eyes flashed, but he concealed his emotions at once. He lowered his head, wanting to mind his own business and not think about her. But then he overheard that they were once again being mocked and ridiculed. From their conversation, it seemed that the reason Natalie had not left the country was most likely because she was being threatened by her family. He didn't know why, but after hearing this, he realized that he had misunderstood her again and that she had not lied to him. A strange feeling suddenly surged up in his heart. But she was still a stranger to him. He didn't intend to help. He watched silently from the sidelines. His eyes widened when he saw Natalie holding a steak knife against her stepsister's neck. Bryce never thought Natalie was capable of doing something like this when she was furious. At that moment, Samuel, who was sitting beside him, spotted what was going on and said excitedly, "Oh, that woman is very feisty." Samuel was his good friend. The two of them had been friends since childhood. They were very close and spoke casually with each other. Bryce raised his glass and took a sip of red wine. He did not respond as he tasted the wine. Quite a few people in the restaurant turned their attention to Natalie. Nick didn't dare to react when he saw Cheryl being held at knife point. He could only shout, "Natalie, I'm warning you. Put the knife down right now or I'll call the police." She shook her head. The knife in her hand moved closer to Cheryl. With a cold look in her eyes, she said, "Not possible. Unless she apologizes to Liam, I won't let her go." Cheryl felt the sharp edge of the knife rubbing against her neck. She was extremely scared, but she said, "Go ahead, do it. I want to see just what you're capable of. Nick, don't worry about me. Just call the police." She gave him a wink. Nick hesitated for a moment, but when he saw Cheryl's anxious expression, he immediately took out his phone and called the police. On the other side of the restaurant, Samuel watched this scene unfold and chuckled. His eyebrows curved slightly as he joked with Bryce, "Things are really getting interesting. When the police come, let me know if I should step in or not. I really like this woman's feistiness. And look at that little boy next to her. He's really cute." Samuel spoke the line with a casualness, but Bryce gave a lot more attention to what he was saying. For some reason, when Bryce heard his words, he felt slightly uncomfortable. He raised his eyebrows and glanced at Samuel coldly, not realizing what his intentions were. Samuel saw Bryce's expression, and his whole body broke out in a cold sweat. To hide his embarrassment, he picked up his wine glass and took a sip. Whether it was intentional or not, his eyes were still looking in Natalie's direction. "Why is Bryce looking at me so coldly?" he thought. "Could it be that he knows this woman?" Soon, the police arrived. After they had inspected the restaurant, they understood the situation. The policeman walked up to Natalie and warned her, "Put the knife down. This is a restaurant." Natalie refused. Even after the police arrived, she repeated what she had been saying. "Get her to apologize to Liam, or I won't let her go." When the police officer heard this, he felt a bit lost and looked at his captain. He saw that the captain was losing patience and frowned. "If you don't let her go, then we'll have to use force." Natalie tensed up, but she remained motionless in the face of the police's threats. She brought the blade closer to Cheryl's neck and said every word carefully. "I don't care. She has to apologize to Liam first." Episode 31. Why is it always him? Natalie was enraged, and no one could stop her. Liam was the person she cared about the most. She had always taken care of him very well. But now Cheryl had insulted him and hurt him emotionally. She would never forgive her. When Cheryl saw the police arrive, she became even cockier and had no intention of apologizing. The situation was at a standstill. The police were helpless. Just as they were about to restrain Natalie, Samuel stood up and walked over to them. "Captain Bryant, what you are doing is wrong. This girl is clearly defending herself. How can you restrain her?" When Captain Bryant heard the voice, he recognized it as belonging to Samuel Hammond. He went up to him and greeted him respectfully. "Mr. Hammond, you're here. I didn't see you." Suddenly, he took note of what Samuel had said. He was a bit confused and asked, "Can you explain what you mean by that?" If it was anyone else, the captain would have ignored them and done what he had to do. But this was not just anyone, it was Samuel Hammond. The captain had no choice but to listen. No one noticed Bryce, because he was sitting in the corner of the restaurant not moving. Everyone cast their gazes on Samuel. He glanced at Natalie and said, "Captain Bryant, the thing is that this man and woman were bullying this woman and her son. So she is doing what she has to do to protect her child. Isn't it unfair for you to take her away just because you've only listened to what other people have told you?" His words were extremely casual, but the meaning in them was obvious. Captain Bryant realized now how the situation had come about. His face was stern and cold as he prepared to instruct his men to restrain Cheryl and Nick. When Cheryl heard what Samuel had said, she immediately became anxious. "Who the hell are you? Stop making things up. If you turn the tables on me, I'll sue you." Samuel sneered at her, and she couldn't help but wince at his gaze. Then he said to the police, "If you don't believe me, you can go and check the surveillance tapes. It will be obvious that they were the ones causing trouble. Everyone here witnessed it." When the other people in the restaurant heard this, they recalled what had happened. Indeed, this couple had provoked Natalie. They immediately confirmed it. "Yes, we saw them picking on her." Nick and Cheryl became the targets now. The police had finally convinced Natalie to put down the knife, but she did not leave Cheryl and held her hands tightly at the back. Now that things had been cleared up, there was nothing for them to do. Nick didn't want to embarrass himself any further, so he gave Cheryl a look and told her to leave. But Natalie refused to let her go. Even though the situation has escalated to this point, Cheryl still had no intention of apologizing to Liam. She would never give in. Seeing the situation was at a standstill, Samuel said, "You still haven't apologized to the boy, and you want to leave?" The restaurant's other patrons started to criticize Nick and Cheryl, too. Nick stood there not knowing what to do. He pursed his lips and said nothing. Cheryl was enraged by Samuel's words to the point that she saw red. She had never imagined that someone would appear halfway through their argument and embarrass her like this. Although Natalie had put down the knife, she was still holding Cheryl's hand tightly, not wanting to leave her so easily. However, Cheryl was adamant. She did not want to admit defeat and allow the other patrons to say whatever they wanted. She would not apologize. But Nick could not bear to stand there and face the criticism of so many people. When he looked at Natalie, there was a hint of complaint in his eyes. But in the end, he had no choice but to lower his head and apologize. "Liam, we're sorry. We shouldn't have said that to you."
Hey, what are you doing? Why should we apologize to them?
Cheryl's expression immediately changed when she heard Nick apologize. Having him apologize to the boy was much more embarrassing than apologizing herself. Now that Nick had apologized to Liam, Natalie knew she couldn't do anything else. She had intended to leave Cheryl, but when she heard Cheryl's question, her eyes squinted dangerously, and she said in a warning tone, "Nick, you heard her. I wanted to let her go, but it seems she doesn't want to leave. This doesn't concern you." She looked hatefully at Cheryl and said very clearly, "You will apologize to Liam, or no one here will be able to save you." Cheryl felt the pain in her hands and let out a groan. She saw the police preparing to leave and felt very resentful. Natalie was determined, and Cheryl knew that Nick and the police would not help her. She had no choice but to reluctantly admit defeat. She glared at Liam and finally said, "I'm sorry." "What are you sorry for? Say it clearly." Natalie would not accept the apology if it didn't sound sincere. Cheryl was so furious that one could see the steam coming out of her ears. But since she had already said she was sorry, she took a deep breath to calm herself down and said, "Sorry, Liam. I didn't mean what I said." Liam was shocked by his mother's bravery. He idolized her. Natalie gave Cheryl a glance, satisfied at last that she had apologized properly. Liam didn't feel hurt anymore, and Natalie was no longer angry. She released Cheryl. "In the future, when you see me, walk the opposite way," Natalie warned her with an icy glare. "I won't let you off so easily next time." Cheryl wanted to retaliate, but Nick pulled her away. She left dejectedly, but before she did, she gave Natalie an angry look. The fiasco was finally over. Cheryl and Nick left the restaurant. Everyone returned to their seats and ignored Natalie. Before the police left, they said their goodbyes to Samuel. Only then did Natalie remember the man who had helped her. She looked around for him, but he was nowhere to be found. She searched the restaurant and finally found him in the VIP room. Although she wasn't sure why he had helped her, she thought it would be rude not to thank him directly. So she took Liam and walked into the room. Sir, I wanted to thank you for helping me earlier." Just as she finished speaking, she looked up and saw Bryce sitting in the room. Why is it always him? Episode 32. Dad, I missed you so much. Natalie froze on the spot when she saw Bryce. She was unable to react. The words she wanted to say were stuck in her throat. Running through her mind was the last conversation she had had with him a few days ago, when she had told him she would be leaving the country. Without realizing what she was doing, she pulled Liam close to her and took a couple of steps back. What if he thought she had been lying? He wouldn't let her off easy, right? Liam's eyes lit up when he saw Bryce, and he quickly rushed over to him. He hugged his leg excitedly and said,
"Dad, there you are. I missed you so much."
Samuel, who was sitting next to Bryce, was speechless when he heard what the little boy said. He looked like a good boy, but Samuel wasn't sure if he was joking or not. He had just called someone his dad, and that someone was Bryce. Everyone knew that Bryce was a cold-hearted man. Once someone had angered him, even if they were a child, they would not be spared. Samuel quickly went over to Liam and said to him, "Little boy, you have the wrong person. This man isn't your dad. You can't go around calling him that so casually, all right?" He was about to squat down to Liam's level, but the boy ignored him and stared at Bryce. His expression was very pitiful. Samuel was a bit embarrassed to be ignored by the boy. He said to Bryce, "Bro, don't get angry. Kids say the darndest things." As he said this, he quietly gestured to Natalie to take her child away. Seeing that Bryce wasn't angry yet, he felt a bit relieved. It would be unthinkable if he got angry, because there would be nothing he could do. Natalie understood what Samuel's gestures meant, but she was slow to react because she still hadn't recovered from the shock of seeing Bryce. She had said she was leaving the country, and now she felt as if he had caught her red-handed. Wasn't this similar to digging your own grave? But there was nothing to be done now. Hopefully, he wouldn't think she was lying to him. She glanced at Bryce, just as he looked at her as well. There was an unknown light shining in his eyes. She felt her scalp tingle as soon as their eyes met. That was it. She was a goner. She had known he would be angry if he saw her again. She didn't know why she cared whether he was angry or not. She quickly went up to Liam and pulled him away, but Bryce was quicker and picked the boy up and sat him on his lap. Natalie and Samuel both looked at him in surprise. Bryce ignored them and asked Liam, "Did you have enough to eat?" Liam shook his head, indicating that he was still hungry. After all, who would be in the mood to eat when horrible people like that came into the restaurant? Bryce immediately put his food down in front of Liam. He said, "Then eat some more. Don't let yourself get hungry." Liam was ecstatic. He had never eaten with his father before, and he was excited. Just as he was about to tuck in, he said to his stunned mother,
Mom, come and eat. Don't let yourself get hungry.
Natalie felt helpless. She knew it would be rude to refuse, so she could only bite the bullet and sit down next to Bryce. For a long while, she didn't touch her fork. Samuel, who was still standing, finally came to his senses. He looked at Bryce in surprise and asked, "What just happened?" Bryce was holding Liam on his lap. He looked coldly at Samuel and kept quiet. Bryce had not denied that Liam was his son, and this left Samuel in total shock. Not only that, but he was hugging the boy as well. Could he be this boy's father? Samuel was on the verge of exploding, but he didn't dare ask Bryce about it, so he sat quietly and secretly observed their interactions. Natalie sat at the table and kept her head down. Bryce stared at her coldly, which made her very uncomfortable. She didn't know what to say. What she really wanted now was to take Liam and run away. If this continued, she thought she would faint. But Liam did not feel the tension between the two of them. He rolled his eyes and said cheekily,
Daddy, I missed you. Mommy has been bullied by bad people. I am not strong enough, and I couldn't protect her.
He felt really sad, and he suddenly burst into tears as he thought of his mom being bullied. Bryce's heart softened. He was very concerned for Liam, so he said, "Tell me what happened." Liam gradually stopped crying.
It's all because of my nasty auntie. She didn't let Mommy leave when we were at the airport. And when Mommy was looking for a job, they didn't let anybody hire her. And today, they were mean to her. They caused a lot of trouble.
Bryce frowned. When he'd overheard the argument, he'd guessed why Natalie hadn't left the country, but now it was confirmed. He hadn't known so many things were happening behind the scenes. No wonder this woman had applied for a job at the lousy Star Entertainment. Now the doubt in Bryce's heart was resolved. Although he did not respond to what Liam had said, the anger he felt in his heart disappeared. His attitude toward Natalie changed. He realized that she must have been too busy arguing to eat before, so he said, "You have something to eat too." Natalie waved her hands and said, "It's all right, I'm full." He must be joking. She had already troubled him enough. How could she bother him any longer, let alone eat with him? Bryce didn't pay any attention to her. Instead, he raised his hand to get the waiter's attention and ordered the dishes Natalie had been eating before. The waiter took the order and left. What had just happened? Samuel was extremely shocked. It seemed they all knew each other. What sort of relationship did they have? And Bryce himself had ordered food for this woman. This was too far-fetched. He had been holding in his curiosity ever since Natalie came into the room, and he couldn't stand it anymore. "Bro, is this your wife? Shouldn't you introduce us?" Natalie was embarrassed and blushed. Before Bryce could reply, she said, "Sir, you've misunderstood. I'm not Bryce's wife. My name is Natalie, and this is my son Liam. I came in here to thank you for helping me just now. My name is Samuel Hammond, and forget it. There's no need to worry about it. Samuel was very polite to Natalie, but he kept looking at Bryce, waiting for him to respond. Episode 33, Went Home Together. Sensing Samuel's burning gaze, Bryce glanced at him, raised his eyebrows, and said, "You've been talking nonstop since you got here. Is the food not to your liking? Shut up and eat, yeah?" Samuel choked on hearing that. This restaurant was part of Bryce's subsidiary company. Who would dare say the food here was not to their liking? He could only bite his tongue. The atmosphere was suddenly slightly awkward. Fortunately, the food for Natalie arrived not long after. She had no choice but to lower her head and focus on her meal. Her intention was to leave with Liam after a short while. But when Natalie had finished her meal, Liam was reluctant to leave. Seeing that his mother was going to leave with him, he held Bryce's hand and shouted,
"Daddy, I want to be with you. Daddy, don't go."
This trick of Liam's often worked, and this occasion was no exception. Bryce hesitated, and Liam, sensing this, quickly continued,
"Dad, don't go, okay? We need Daddy. Daddy will protect us. Mommy and I won't be bullied by bad people."
Natalie wished the earth would open up and swallow her. She was speechless and didn't know where Liam had learned to say these kinds of things. Embarrassed, she was about to explain, but Bryce frowned and asked her, "Where do you live now? We'll get you home." Natalie hesitated for a moment, but realized it was very rare for Liam to be so reliant on someone. With that in mind, she followed her heart and told Bryce their address. Liam was very excited during the drive home. He couldn't sit still. He was so curious about everything, pointing here and there while Bryce held him. Natalie, though, stared out of the car window in a daze. Samuel was driving, but he looked in the rearview mirror. He caught Bryce's gaze, intentionally or unintentionally, then glanced at Natalie's profile. He was even more bewildered seeing their reactions. It seemed they did not have a close relationship, but maybe it wasn't that simple. The car soon arrived at Natalie's place. Natalie heaved a sigh of relief and said, "Thank you for today. We'll head in now." Natalie was about to carry Liam out of the car, but instead, Liam looked at Bryce, wide-eyed, and asked,
"Daddy, aren't you coming in with us?"
Natalie didn't know what had got into Liam today, constantly pestering Bryce and calling him Daddy. If it had only happened once or twice, she could have forgiven Liam for not being sensible. But now she felt that he was going overboard. She was losing her patience. She scolded Liam softly, "Liam, stop being naughty. Come with Mommy now." Seeing his mom getting angry, Liam let go of Bryce's hand and nodded his head sadly, saying,
"I'm sorry, Mommy. I didn't mean to make you angry. I just missed Daddy."
Liam's eyes were getting red and tears started to fall. He felt unfairly scolded by his mom. Bryce had no intention of going into the building with them, but seeing Liam like this made his heart ache again. He hesitated, but did not move. Samuel noticed the little boy's face, and his heart started to melt. He urged Bryce, "Bryce, how about you take the little guy up? I'll wait for you here." He gave Bryce a wink as he spoke, ensuring Bryce understood his meaning. Bryce glared at Samuel, thinking that he really was very annoying. Samuel rubbed the tip of his nose and laughed nervously. Knowing Bryce had a bad temper, he didn't want to provoke him. Natalie said, "We've troubled you enough already. It's fine, really. There's no need." "Liam, say goodbye to both uncles. Let's go." It was difficult for Liam not to show his disappointment, but he obeyed his mom and said farewell to Bryce and Samuel. Just as Liam was about to get out of the car, he asked Bryce,
"Dad, will you come and visit us?"
Bryce looked perplexed, but seeing Liam's hopeful look, he nodded. Liam smiled broadly and said,
"Yes,"
pumping his fist before joining his mom. Bryce stared at Natalie and Liam through the car window as they walked away, his gaze never leaving them. Samuel, looking at Bryce in the rearview mirror, realized Bryce was not the child's father. He assumed the little boy must be mistaken about Bryce being his dad. However, the way Bryce was handling the situation surprised Samuel. It was obvious that Bryce didn't despise the child. This was miracle enough in itself. Samuel knew there was no point in questioning Bryce about this, as he would not give him a straight answer. So he asked casually, "Bryce, are you going home now?" Bryce looked at him coldly and said, "Yes, let's go." Samuel nodded before starting the car and driving away. Natalie stopped outside the building entrance. She'd sensed Bryce's gaze on her all the way up to the walk, and she felt confused. When they got indoors, she planned on telling Liam not to call Bryce Dad anymore. The poor kid was missing a father's love, and Natalie felt sorry for him. But at the same time, she couldn't continue to let him call Bryce Daddy when Bryce wasn't really his father. As Natalie walked up the stairs, she saw a familiar figure at the entrance to the corridor. When she saw the man, her face turned cold and she said, "What are you doing here? You're not welcome here. Go away." Liam also saw the man and subconsciously moved in front of his mom to protect her, shouting,
"You're a bad person, and you're not allowed to bully my mom."
Natalie was worried that Liam would get hurt, so she pulled him behind her to shield him. She looked cautiously at the man. It was the man she'd had the standoff with this evening and didn't want to see, Nick Barnard. It would have been very easy, she thought, for the Barnard family to find out where she was living if they'd wanted to. She was furious at that realization. Nick probably came here when he left the restaurant, waiting for her to return. He hadn't even changed his clothes. Nick looked at Liam, starting to feel restless. Nick thought about how, if the accident hadn't happened, he would still be with Natalie, and it would be him standing beside Natalie instead of this little boy. Thinking about this, Nick's expression soured. He glared at her. "Natalie, we've known each other for over a decade, and you know how I treated you. Because of our past, I didn't want to hurt you." Natalie interrupted him coldly. "Stop it. I don't want to talk about the past, so there's no need to say anything." But as soon as she said that, she felt pain in her heart. If Nick had believed in her at the beginning, would they really have ended up like this? Episode 34. An Angry Nick. Anger was written all over Nick's face. He said, "Natalie, you betrayed me back then and I let it go. All these years, the person who has been there to support and accompany me is Cheryl. So if you even think about hurting her, don't blame me for getting mad. So you came all the way over here today to give me a warning?" There was ridicule in Natalie's eyes as she smirked coldly. Nick saw that smirk and realized that she was no longer the same person she had been. The Natalie he had known back then was never this cold and hard. Suddenly, he felt his heart ache. Nick took a deep breath and closed his eyes helplessly. He could only comfort himself by reminding himself that this was the woman who had betrayed him. She was no longer the Natalie he used to know. "Natalie," he went on, "all Cheryl does is speak well of you. Don't you realize that it was because of her that your father permitted you to return? When you slept with someone else and betrayed me, it was Cheryl that tried to cover up for you. It was so painful. I couldn't bear it. If Cheryl hadn't been there for me, I don't know what I would have done." Natalie felt even more bitter. Everything that had happened, it seemed, had been manipulated by Cheryl. And now the tables were turned, and suddenly it was her fault? She really had to applaud Cheryl's skillful scheming. Perhaps a fool like Nick would actually believe Cheryl. Natalie couldn't help but feel a little sorry for him. She said, "Are you done talking? If so, please leave. You're not welcome here." Natalie thought, there's nothing left to explain. And anyway, since it happened a long time ago, and it was now far in the past, there was no point explaining it. She moved to go past Nick, taking out her keys to open the door. But Nick was angered by Natalie's attitude. He blocked her way and said condescendingly, "Natalie, after all those years you spent abroad, I thought you'd changed. But no, you're still the same selfish person that thinks only about herself. Why was I even with you back then? I was really blind." This last remark riled Natalie. He was really pushing their already delicate relationship to a point where they would be worse than strangers. Losing her patience, Natalie snorted. "I see that you haven't changed either after all these years. You're still a brainwashed fool. Now get lost. I don't even want to look at you." She quickly pushed Liam in front of her and approached the door. Nick banged his fist on the door in anger, refusing to let Natalie go in. "Natalie,
You were the one that did the shameful thing. You let me down. And now you're acting like you were wrongly accused? You really are despicable."
Nick saw her expression change, and he felt better after giving vent to what he'd kept locked inside him all these years. He said,
"You're lucky. Cheryl still thinks about you and was able to find someone to be with you. Otherwise, who would want to be with you? A single mother with a kid like that?"
Furious, Natalie shouted, "You ass! Get the hell out of here!" She pushed Nick away from the door, opened it, and went inside with Liam, slamming the door shut behind her. She was afraid that if Nick didn't leave, she wouldn't be able to keep her composure and would break down. After all was said and done, he was still a man whom she had loved deeply long back. But Nick was still outside the door, refusing to move. He called out,
"Natalie, let me give you a word of advice, yeah? You should accept the arrangement. Otherwise, when the time comes, the Davidsons will use any means they have to force you to accept it. I'd like to see how much better off you'd be."
"Get lost!" Natalie shouted through the door. After a long while, Nick left, and it was finally quiet outside. Natalie was able to relax at last and leaned against the door, her face sad. Nick had completely ruined her good mood. She knew now that the Davidsons wouldn't let go of this arrangement. She had to think of a way around it. She couldn't let them get hold of Liam again and use him to threaten her. Liam, watching from the shadows, could see how worried she was. He blurted out,
"Mommy, Daddy is really amazing. Why don't you let him protect us? Let Daddy protect us."
An image of Bryce's arrogant face appeared in her mind. It was true that Bryce could protect them, but why would such a capable and powerful man want to be with a single mom with a child? Natalie pulled Liam over and hugged him. Patiently, she said, "Liam, don't talk such nonsense. That person is not your dad, so we can't bother him anymore or annoy him." Liam nodded reluctantly. He looked at his mom with wide eyes, wanting to speak, but kept his thoughts to himself. But Natalie only saw Liam nod. Unaware of what he was really thinking, she felt relieved. "Come on," she said, "let's get cleaned up," and headed for the bathroom. Liam finished his shower quickly and went to his bedroom. Natalie was very tired after the stressful day, so she decided to have a nap herself after she finished taking her shower. Liam lay on his bed but couldn't fall asleep. He kept thinking about the incident this evening when Nick had come to cause trouble at their home. Feeling panicky and desperate with fear, he decided that there was no option but to use his mom's phone to secretly call Bryce. Bryce had arrived home earlier after Samuel dropped him off. As soon as Bryce stepped through the door, he heard his parents talking about him in the living room. His mother was talking as he walked into the living room. Bryce's marriage is top priority. "Oh, Bryce, you're back. Your father and I were just talking about how your grandparents have found a few delightful women for you to meet this weekend. We hope you can take the time to meet them." Bryce, taking off his jacket, paused. He sighed helplessly at his mother's words, but didn't say anything. He had gotten used to Michelle's methods of persuasion a long time ago. He had respected his mother from a very young age, but whenever she brought up the marriage issue, he would always find an excuse or change the topic so as to avoid the conversation. Today, Bryce was particularly reluctant to discuss the subject. "I've been very busy lately, Mom. Perhaps some other weekend." Then Bryce suddenly had a thought. It didn't matter whom he married, just as long as he was married. That meant he could marry anyone he wanted. Natalie's image suddenly appeared in his mind. When Michelle saw her son wasn't a bit interested in talking about the matter, she thought about trying to persuade him, but Bryce's phone suddenly rang, interrupting them. Bryce saw the caller ID and frowned. Natalie's number. The moment he thought of her, she called him. What a coincidence. Bryce wasn't really sure that he wanted to answer Natalie's call, but almost without realizing it, he automatically pressed the answer button. Episode 35. Will You Marry Me?
"What's the matter?"
Bryce's voice was cold, distant. Liam, on the other end of the line, was stunned for a moment. He hadn't expected Bryce to actually answer the phone. He froze. Bryce, unsure if the caller had hung up, looked at his phone. He was about to hang up when Liam's small, scared voice came out of the phone's speaker.
Dad, I'm so scared. That bad uncle just blocked the door and was bullying Mommy. I'm scared.
Bryce's expression darkened, and an intense light filled his eyes. Immediately, he grabbed his jacket and left the villa. Michelle saw her son leave in a hurry. She was very confused and wondered what had happened. Why would Bryce be in such a rush to leave so suddenly without saying anything? Meanwhile, at Natalie's place, she was relaxing. Her hair was still wet. She was so tired she hadn't bothered to dry it. She watched Liam, who was drawing pictures and occasionally looking up to check the time. Natalie was about to tell Liam to go to bed and rest when the doorbell suddenly rang. The bell startled her. The things that Nick had said about the Davidsons before he left were still fresh in her mind. Would they really come this late? Liam's eyes lit up when he heard the doorbell, but Natalie didn't notice. She went to open the door. Bryce had an icy expression on his face when Natalie opened the door. She stared at Bryce, her eyes wide, not knowing how to react for a moment. He looked at Natalie. Her skin and hair were glowing after her shower. Her skin was like porcelain, he thought. Natalie blushed, noticing him staring at her. Confused, she closed the door. Bryce was still standing outside the door, but he wasn't angry. Instead, thinking about her being so startled, he felt a surge of sympathy and affection for Natalie. Natalie went to the bedroom to change her clothes. Meanwhile, Liam opened the door and welcomed Bryce in. Bryce was able to size up the 2 rooms in front of him. Although the house was small, it felt very cozy and welcoming. Natalie walked out of the bedroom. Seeing Bryce sitting on the sofa, she couldn't help but ask awkwardly, "What are you doing here?" Bryce asked bluntly, "Where is that guy? The one who was here?" Natalie immediately realized he was asking about Nick. She stuttered a reply, "He is gone already," then asked, suddenly suspicious, "Hold on, how did you know he was here?" Bryce looked at her but did not respond. She immediately thought, "Must be Liam again," and said, "Look, everything is all right now. Did you really come all the way out here for that?" Bryce realized that Liam had tricked him and shot the boy a sulky look. He would help if Liam asked, sure, but that didn't mean he would let himself be taken advantage of. But Bryce wasn't able to be as stern and cold-hearted with this little guy as he was with other people. No one ever dared to take advantage of Bryce's position. Liam could be considered to be the first to have tried. When Liam saw Bryce's dissatisfied expression, he got a bit scared and pretended to be sorry.
Dad, I didn't lie to you. That bad uncle came and insulted Mommy. He threatened Mommy. He said he would come back and force Mommy to marry an old man.
"Liam, don't say another word," Natalie scolded him, starting to get angry. She really didn't know why her little boy seemed to play up so much every time he saw Bryce. Liam, seeing his mother was angry at him, didn't dare say anything more. He pulled on her sleeve, trying to placate her. When Bryce saw the mother and son's interactions, his eyes flashed with sudden emotion. He said with a preamble, "Natalie, would you be willing to marry me?" Natalie, shocked, almost choked. She wasn't sure if she had heard him correctly, so she asked, "What did you say?" Bryce's expression darkened. He had blurted out the question just then, in the grip of his emotions, but he knew he couldn't take it back. He looked at Natalie and said, "Well, your family wants you to marry that old man, so why don't we get married instead? If you marry me, no one will dare threaten you anymore. And anyway, my family is pressuring me to get married. We would be doing each other a favor." Natalie frowned and said, "So that would be a fake marriage, and we'd not interfere with each other's lives?" The marriage proposal was a huge shock to Natalie, and she still couldn't believe what she had heard. Bryce actually was considering marrying her? Is this person crazy? Or maybe he isn't thinking clearly? And how can he be so casual when discussing his own marriage? But she had to admit that if she was with Bryce, her and Liam's life would be better. And yet, somehow, this did not seem fair to Bryce. She said, "Bryce, please don't joke around." Then, feeling confused, she added hesitantly, "Even if we were to get married, would your family agree to it? Don't you have to take into account what they would think?" The questions from Natalie made Bryce slightly upset. He didn't like to see Natalie having all these doubts, but he got the feeling that this woman was not a bad person. Bryce said, "I've never cared what other people think or feel when I do something. All you need to tell me is whether you'll marry me or not. If you agree to my proposal, I'll see you at the courthouse tomorrow. Meet me there at noon, okay?" After he finished speaking, Natalie was even more surprised at his haste. Was Bryce marrying her because he was sick and tired of his family pressurizing him? Or did he just want to help her? Bryce stood up, ready to leave without waiting for her reply. But when he reached the door, he suddenly turned around. His face was expressionless as he reminded her, "If we get married, this marriage will only be a formal arrangement. You don't need to fulfill all the duties of a wife. It'll be mutually beneficial for both of us. Don't just think about yourself, but also about your child. If he gets kidnapped again, you'll have no one to help you." He didn't say any more, just glanced at Liam before turning and leaving. Episode 36, I'm Calling the Police. After Bryce's proposal, Natalie was incredibly restless the whole night. For one thing, she couldn't get Nick's threats out of her mind, and at other times in the night, she was thinking about Liam crying when he was taken away by the Davidson family. All of these things distressed Natalie deeply. After tossing and turning over and over, Natalie still couldn't decide how to respond to Bryce's proposal. Bryce's offer was tempting, that was for sure. It would solve her current problems, but she couldn't be so selfish and ignore the feelings of others. Before Natalie knew it, the morning light had come into the sky. She got up. Liam was exhausted after following his mother around for the past few days and had not woken up yet. Seeing Liam still sleeping, a benevolent smile spread across Natalie's face. She bent down and gently kissed his cute and adorable face. Then she went to prepare the things she needed to take to the office in the afternoon. She was just finishing her breakfast when there was a heavy, insistent knocking on the door. Last night, when Bryce came over, he had been a gentleman and pressed the doorbell. This time, Natalie had a gut feeling that the people hammering on her door had come with bad intentions. Natalie took a deep breath, walked over and opened the door. What she saw when she opened the door was Tom, his face a combination of anger and impatience. He snorted. "Took you long enough to open the damn door." He glanced at Natalie with contempt, walking in uninvited with 2 bodyguards trailing behind him. Natalie's heart sank when she saw the bodyguards. She said to Tom, "Why are you here? You know I've cut all ties with you and want nothing to do with you anymore. Please leave my house." But Tom was in no rush to leave. Instead, he strolled around the house as if he owned it. He finally said disdainfully, "I thought you would be living the good life after quitting our family, but it seems like you're no better off. Why don't you be a good girl and come back with me to marry the guy I've set up for you? I'm sure you'll be grateful in the future if you do." Natalie frowned resentfully. She'd known her father must have had an ulterior motive in coming here. "Whether I'm living a good life or not is none of your concern," she said. "I had cut all ties with the family the day you threw me out of the house 5 years ago." Tom's fury was evident on his face. He glared at his daughters, spitting out, "What? You think you have a backbone now and can be independent? You don't even want to acknowledge the Davidson family anymore? Would I have kicked you out back then if you hadn't shamed the family so badly?" Natalie's expression changed slightly as her heart ached for a moment. If her father knew the truth about what had happened, would he forgive her? But she knew at the same time that she was probably being too naive. She had always been the expendable one in the Davidson family, so why would Tom believe her even if he heard the truth? But maybe it was still worth trying? Just as she was about to explain what happened 5 years ago, Tom continued, "Even if you wanted to come back to the family now, there's no way we'd support a freeloader. So I'll give you one more chance. Will you marry the man that I have chosen for you?" "What if I say no?" Natalie asked, stubbornly refusing to bow down to him. Tom scowled and gave the 2 bodyguards a discreet sign unseen by Natalie. He said, "Whether you are willing to marry this man or not, Natalie, the truth is that I was just being polite when I asked you. The reality is that I'll be making the decision for you." Before Natalie could react, the 2 bodyguards swept past her, heading straight for the bedroom. She realized their target was Liam. She gripped the door handle tight and said, "This is my private property and you are intruding. If you take another step, I'm calling the police."
Tom had been prepared for this. He snorted dismissively. I suggest you save your breath. Liam has suffered a lot while he's been staying with you. As his grandfather, I am here to protect him from that suffering. And once you have done your duty, I will of course send him to a good place. Natalie couldn't believe what she was hearing. She said, just what is that supposed to mean? She could hear the bodyguards moving around in the bedroom. Tom ignored Natalie's question. When he saw Natalie panicking, a hint of happiness flashed in his eyes. She was stunned. She couldn't just stand by and let Tom get his way. She had to think of a countermeasure. Suddenly, Natalie realized what the solution was. There was no other choice. She had to marry Bryce to keep Liam safe. She said to Tom, I have to go to the bathroom. I think I'm going to throw up. She rushed past him, and as soon as she was in the bathroom, she pulled out her phone, dialing furiously. Bryce was driving to his office when Natalie's caller ID came up on his phone. He had a strange, ominous feeling, but answered the phone anyway. He was about to speak when he heard her voice, which was full of panic. She gasped out, Bryce, I will marry you, I will, but can you please come over to my place right now? Bryce frowned and asked, Natalie, what's happening? Natalie had to keep her answer short, as she didn't have much time. My father is here with his bodyguards. Liam and I are being held captive. Right, I understand. Hang in there just a bit longer. Bryce hung up. Natalie didn't know what had just happened and looked at her phone. The screen was now blank, but she suddenly felt sure that everything would be all right. Somehow she wasn't as scared as she had been. Natalie went back to the living room and was shocked to see Liam sitting on the sofa crying. He looked helplessly at Natalie. Her heart ached seeing this. She was about to go to Liam's side, but the two bodyguards stopped her. She walked angrily towards her father and said, Let Liam go right now. He's only a kid, for heaven's sake. Tom's smile was vicious. He clearly couldn't care less how frightened and sad Liam was. Tom said, I already told you. If you just do what I ask, Liam won't be harmed. Seeing Liam's hopeless condition, she finally broke down and yelled at Tom, You heartless man! How can you treat your own grandson like this? Natalie, overwrought, felt she had to act quickly. She shoved the bodyguard aside, catching him by surprise, and was about to make a break for the door. At that moment, the doorbell rang. The three men looked at each other, unsure about who was outside. Tom's expression changed. He gritted his teeth and barked at one of the bodyguards, Open the door. When the door opened, two cops were standing outside. Before Tom could react, the two cops showed their badges and IDs. The older of them said, We're here because someone called the police and said that someone was trespassing. The cop looked at Liam and then at the bodyguards before saying, Please don't cause any trouble. We need you to cooperate with our investigation. Episode 37, A Married Woman. Tom was nonplussed for a moment. He knew that it must have been Natalie who called the cops. He faked a smile and said smoothly, Officer, I'm sure that you can see there's been a misunderstanding. This is my daughter's home, and I'm here to visit her. How could I be trespassing? The two cops looked at each other confused. Bryce hadn't told the police dispatcher that the trespassers included the woman's father. What was going on? Natalie heard the conversation taking place near the doorway. She understood what was going on and somehow found the strength to break free from the bodyguard. She ran to the doorway, desperate, shouting, Officers, please! These are bad people! Please, help me! The force of Natalie's emotional appeal meant that nothing Tom said would sway the officers. The cops issued Tom a warning, and he had no choice but to angrily leave his daughter's house, taking his two bodyguards with him. But as he left, he gave Natalie a warning stare. His eyes were filled with a monstrous rage. Unable to look at him, she closed her eyes in dejection. She hadn't realized her father despised her so much, but now his contempt for her was clear. Although the tension in the room gradually faded after Tom left, her face was pale as she held Liam in her arms. Luckily, Liam was a strong-willed boy, and this nasty experience hadn't affected him too much. Natalie knew that without such resilience, Liam would have had a terrible childhood. And she also knew that if anything were to happen to Liam, she wouldn't be able to survive. She was immensely grateful that Bryce had helped them this time. Natalie shook off her churning emotions and decided to take Liam to see Bryce. If she'd thought about it a bit more, she might have changed her mind, but she was really afraid something might happen to Liam, and that overrode everything else. Bryce had just arrived near Natalie's home.
He was awestruck when he saw Natalie. It seemed like her face was glowing in the morning sunlight. Bryce suddenly realized how attractive he found her. Although still in a daze, Natalie noticed Bryce's ostentatious Cadillac. She went over and hustled Liam into the car. Bryce looked at Natalie expressionlessly. "Did you bring all the documents?" Bryce asked, straight to the point as ever. Natalie felt uncomfortable under his stare. She could only nod and reply, "Yes, I brought them all." Bryce didn't say anything else, just drove Natalie to the courthouse to arrange their marriage certificate. As it was still early, there weren't many people at the courthouse. When Natalie and Bryce walked in, they didn't have to wait long before it was their turn. A woman in charge of marriage registrations looked admiringly at Bryce's distinguished appearance, but when she looked at Natalie, there was hostility in her eyes. Natalie felt very awkward being stared at, and she was dispirited to realize how much charm and power Bryce exuded. She somehow seemed to foresee their future. If she married Bryce, other people would most likely think Bryce was a miserable partner in the marriage. After all, she wasn't as prominent as Bryce and couldn't match his worth, she thought. Noticing Natalie's nervousness, Bryce frowned. He held her hand to reassure her. He said, "What's on your mind? Are you regretting getting married to me?" He was smiling and his eyes were beaming. As he leaned close to her, she could feel his breath on her neck. Natalie blushed, lowered her head to hide her embarrassment, and quickly pushed him away. She said, "No, of course not. Come on, let's go and get our picture taken." She dragged Bryce to the area where the photographers took snaps of the newlywed couples. While they were posing for their picture, Natalie felt awkward with Bryce so close to her, but gradually the dispirited feeling she'd had was slipping away from her. After a short while, they emerged from the courthouse with the marriage certificate. "So that's it?" thought Natalie. "We got married just like that?" Liam, who was waiting outside, was really excited and happy to see the marriage certificate in his mom and dad's hands. He said,
I am so happy. Finally, you guys have married. This is great. Now I can live with Daddy.
Liam saw his mother was still in a daze. He quickly went to her side and pulled her sleeve to get her attention.
Mommy, aren't you happy? We're not alone anymore. From now on, no one will dare to bully us.
Natalie gave him a hug. She felt content seeing him so happy. Bryce's heart swelled when he saw this. He reached out his hand almost automatically and gently stroked her hair. Natalie, surprised, looked at him with a perplexed expression and asked, "What's the matter?" Bryce flinched and drew his hand back, but he quickly regained his composure. He said, "I've already arranged for someone to pack up all your stuff so you can move in with me today." She nodded. She knew it was natural for them to live together since they were married, even though it was just a formal agreement. And she knew that she couldn't live at her old place anymore now that Tom knew where she lived. She knew that Tom wouldn't just let this go. She nodded gratefully and said, "Thank you." "There's no need to thank me. This is the least I should be doing," Bryce replied. Then he took out a prepared contract from his bag and handed it to Natalie. "Here, look through this." Natalie took it suspiciously. There were quite a few provisions in it. But at the same time, Natalie secretly admired Bryce's thoroughness. She began to read the clauses one by one. The contract was extensive. It stated that they would not interfere with each other's lives during their marriage, and that they were only to maintain the illusion of a normal marriage when they were outside their home. Bryce also highlighted a few clauses that made it clear that either party could terminate the agreement at any time. The agreed distribution of interests and properties between the two parties was also clearly stated. After Natalie finished reading the contract, she felt relieved. At least everything would be very clear in advance, meaning that there would be no awkwardness or arguments later on, even though she never had any intention of taking advantage of Bryce. Checking the contract once more, Natalie realized there wasn't a clause stipulating that there was no need for the parties to carry out the full duties of husband and wife. Episode 38, A Match Made in Heaven. When Natalie saw this clause was missing, she said to Bryce, "Oh, one thing about this contract. There doesn't seem to be a clause about the husband and wife's intimate personal obligations to each other." Bryce looked at Natalie with distaste and said, "You don't have to worry. Not every woman is my cup of tea." And then he added Natalie's desired term to the contract right there and then. She was speechless. She felt that Bryce sometimes had a really vicious tongue. Having the additional term in the contract made Natalie feel much better. The relationship between the two of them was in title only. In private, she didn't want to have anything to do with this man. Everyone knew not to mess with Bryce. If their relationship became too complicated, she wouldn't know how to deal with the consequences. Placated, Natalie signed her name at the end of each copy of the contract. Bryce took the contracts and gave one to Natalie to keep without saying another word. Then Bryce took her to his home. For her part, she was surprised to find that he lived in such a big mansion. The mansion was one of the most prominent houses in the area, set in an exclusive estate with a private beach and a big park. It was like the family had their own little territory. Security was very strict. No uninvited guest had ever got in. When Natalie saw the location with her own eyes, she thought she was dreaming. She'd never thought that Bryce owned such an estate. She tried to calculate the size of the mansion. She thought that Bryce, as a single man, would be living in a one-bedroom apartment. But incredibly, it seemed that this entire place was his. She followed him into the mansion complex. She took Liam's hand and entered the house slowly. Liam himself was amazed by the mansion and the beach. The servants and butlers inside the mansion greeted Bryce respectfully. "Welcome home, sir." He nodded and gestured for Natalie to come up beside him. He introduced her to them. "This is my wife, Natalie, and this little boy is our son." When Bryce finished the introductions, Mrs. Perkins, the housekeeper, was shocked. She was speechless, staring blankly at Natalie and Liam. Mrs. Perkins had been with the Clare family for decades and had watched Bryce grow up from a very young age. Since when did he have such a big child? Mrs. Perkins, feeling very confused, stared at Liam. Looking closely at the little guy, she suddenly thought he looked a little similar to Bryce when he was a little boy. Her eyes widened in recognition, and she suddenly took Liam as Bryce's own. She was so excited that she became very emotional. Through her tears, she said, "You have finally gotten married. Now your parents can finally relax, Mr. Bryce." Seeing Mrs. Perkins so emotional, Natalie felt awkward standing there. She had not expected Bryce to introduce her and Liam in such a manner, as his wife and son. How was she supposed to explain the real circumstances of their arrangement now? While Natalie was lost in thought, Bryce told her, "If there's anything you need, anything at all, you can ask Mrs. Perkins. She understands everything and is very capable." Mrs. Perkins wiped away her tears and enthusiastically said to Natalie, "Yes, that's right, Mrs. Bryce. If there's anything you need, just let me know." Natalie quickly nodded and replied shyly, "Thank you." But in fact, she was thinking that this was only a contractual marriage with no real feelings, so she wouldn't bother Mrs. Perkins with requests. She didn't like to trouble other people, generally speaking. Mrs. Perkins read her thoughts. Seeing her act so politely, like a woman from a good family, she immediately took a liking to her. "Mr. Bryce's wife," she thought, "seems to be easy to get along with. The couple looks like a perfect match." With great enthusiasm, Mrs. Perkins took them upstairs to show them their room. Feeling embarrassed, Natalie followed Mrs. Perkins up the stairs to Bryce's room. The room was very spacious, done in the European style, but still very simple, with a chilly, austere atmosphere. Natalie couldn't help but sigh. His room really did match his character. While Natalie was looking around the room, Mrs. Perkins said, "This room is rather gloomy, don't you think? Now that you will be living here, do you think I should add something else here?" Natalie was startled. Did Mrs. Perkins think she was going to be staying in the same room as Bryce? Her thoughts were very confused. Just then, Bryce said, "She will be staying in the guest room for the time being. We'll have someone come in and remodel the master bedroom in a few days' time." Natalie felt relieved at that. It could be that he sensed her awkwardness, or maybe he was just saying it casually. Either way, she looked at him gratefully for suggesting this alternative. Mrs. Perkins thought Bryce was very attentive. She nodded in agreement, happy to see the pair of them getting on so well. Then she went downstairs to bring Liam back up with her. As they were walking, she asked him, "What's your name?" Liam looked up at the kind woman and felt a bond with her. He said,
"My name is Liam."
Seeing the little guy was so well-mannered and sensible, Mrs. Perkins liked him even more. She picked him up and carried him the rest of the way upstairs. She took him to look at the other rooms. Natalie and Bryce were alone. She didn't know what to say and looked at him helplessly. After a short while, he looked at the time. He stood up and said to her, "I have a meeting I need to attend." With those words, he turned and left, paying no attention to Natalie. She sighed. Bryce still had the same attitude as when she first met him, cold and emotionless. But in a way, this suited her, as it meant she could get along with him without any emotions getting tangled up. After Bryce left, she stood alone in the room, exploring its exquisite decoration and features. She suddenly felt overwhelmed. All of this felt very surreal, like a dream. How had she come to move in with this man so quickly? Bryce went straight to the company offices. His schedule was really busy, but he had made some exceptions because of Natalie. Episode 39, Alone All These Years. Bryce entered his office. Recalling how happy Mrs. Perkins had looked when she first met Liam, he felt a slight heartache. If he had a little boy of his own, truly his own, would he be as cute and adorable as Liam? Just then, Samuel hurried into Bryce's office and asked him bluntly, "Bryce, is it true that you've got married?" Bryce wasn't too happy that someone had already found out and said, "How the heck did you know?" Samuel said, "My aunt told me. I couldn't believe it at first. So it's really true?" The traditional stereotype is that women love to gossip, but men are much worse. If Samuel's aunt didn't work at the courthouse, Samuel wouldn't have gotten such an important tidbit of juicy information so quickly. Bryce's frown deepened. How could he have forgotten that Samuel's aunt worked at the courthouse? "Go and give your aunt a call and tell her to keep this to herself," said Bryce, concerned. Samuel nodded. "Don't worry, I've already informed her. But come on, tell me how this happened. You got married? This is really unbelievable. Wow! Who's the lucky lady?" For Samuel, the news that his dignified and prominent CEO had gotten married was pretty much the news story of the century. Samuel kept blabbering on, but Bryce ignored him and continued to focus on the documents he needed for this meeting. Samuel was trying to guess who it was that Bryce had married, but seeing how calm Bryce was, he couldn't help but think of one particular person. He decided to risk it and asked doubtfully, "Bryce, you didn't marry Natalie from last night, did you?" He stopped reading the documents, raised his head, and said, "So what if I did?" Samuel slapped his thigh. So it really was Natalie. He saw there was something between the two of them, but he couldn't pinpoint what. "Bryce, I can't believe you're actually married. I thought you'd be single for the rest of your life." Samuel couldn't help but sigh, but at the same time, he couldn't fathom the logic at work here. Bryce cast a cold glance at him and said, "You're overthinking it. It's true that for a while I had no intention of getting married, but that doesn't mean I want to stay single forever." Samuel was a good friend. If anyone else had asked these questions, he wouldn't even have considered explaining. However, Samuel obviously had doubts about Bryce's explanation, so he pressed further. "I still think it's a strange move. You were obviously deeply hurt back in the past. I mean, that's why you've been on your own." Before he could finish his question, Bryce gave him such a cold stare that Samuel immediately shut up. Bryce looked away and said airily, "Natalie is my wife now. She has nothing to do with anyone else, or with the past. As for me being deeply hurt, who in the world is in a position to hurt me deeply? That will never happen." But while thinking this, he recalled that enchanting night 5 years ago. That was the only time in his life when he had lost control and had slept with a woman he didn't know. Normally, he kept his feelings under tight rein. Samuel quickly nodded in agreement. "All right, I get it, Bryce. Look, just ignore what I said, okay?" That seemed to finish the discussion on the subject. But Samuel got serious again and asked another question. "Natalie has a child with another man. Will your family accept this marriage?" Bryce said scornfully, "Do I need anyone's permission when I do things around here?" Samuel gave a sigh and didn't press any further. He knew that there was always a reason behind everything Bryce did. Then Samuel considered for a moment before saying, "You just got married. Why not invite a few of your friends and colleagues out for a drink with Natalie to celebrate?" He only asked this because he wanted to see how Bryce treated his new wife. In all the time Samuel had known him, he had never seen a caring, gentle side of Bryce. It would definitely be an eye-opener. He shook his head in refusal. She hasn't got time to socialize. Let's talk about it some other time. Samuel thought, so now Bryce is married. He's arranging his wife's daily schedule. Will she have much of a say about her future? It was true that Natalie was busy, but not in the way Samuel thought. After they'd returned home from the courthouse, Mrs. Perkins had given mother and son a tour of Bryce's estate. By the time the estate tour was finished, it was already afternoon. Even though they were married now, Natalie didn't want to rely on Bryce for everything. She still wanted to be independent and work hard. Most importantly, she needed to try and get the Davidson family out of her hair as soon as possible. She decided to go to the office, to her new job. When she arrived, though, she found that the atmosphere in the office was strange. Everyone was anxious. Not many people were in the office, but even those who always had work to do were no longer engaged in their tasks. Everyone seemed to be standing idle. She got the receptionist's attention and said, "What's going on? Why is the atmosphere like this?" When the receptionist saw Natalie, a new face, she was surprised. She hadn't expected the company to be recruiting someone new at this time of year. She replied honestly to her, "The company's performance has not been so great lately, so there's a restructuring going on. Lots of people here are losing their jobs, so the atmosphere is naturally not too good." Natalie was more confused. Was this the kind of luck she needed? Did this mean that she would lose her job before she even started? Wanting to know where she stood, Natalie went to the HR department to look for the HR manager who had interviewed her. When the HR manager saw Natalie, he was slightly taken aback. Not wanting to beat around the bush, Natalie said, "What's going to happen to the company? You didn't mention anything about this restructuring when you offered me the job." The HR manager sighed helplessly and explained, "Natalie, unfortunately, this is not my decision to make. I can only do what the higher-ups tell me. The company will be restructuring in the next 2 days. I'll be able to inform you then whether or not you'll be staying." Natalie realized there was nothing she could do but wait. She left the office feeling extremely frustrated. Episode 40. A Good Woman. Natalie went home and thought with frustration about starting to look for another job from scratch. She felt depressed. She had already had to accept that she would be working for a small firm rather than a major well-known company, and now this restructuring had happened. Liam, seeing that his mom was not her usual self, pulled at her sleeve in his familiar way and asked in a concerned voice,
"Mommy, what happened? Did someone upset you today?"
Natalie's heart filled with warmth when she realized Liam was worried about her. She crouched down and gave him a hug. "Liam, I might not have a job after all. I may not be able to support you anymore." She got emotional. She didn't want Liam to feel the burden she was carrying. He shook his head and said in a positive manner,
"It's okay, Mommy. Daddy can help raise me."
This acted on Natalie like a slap in the face. Angrily, she said, "Liam, you are not allowed to think or say that. His money belongs to him, and as a woman, I've to depend on myself, not spend another man's money. Do you understand?" Liam looked puzzled, so Natalie softened. "Of course, when you grow up and start earning money yourself, don't forget about your mother, okay?" She tried to coax him, but it obviously didn't convince the smart boy. Liam creased his forehead and looked at his mother. Then he said,
"Mommy, I am still young. I don't understand all this."
Bryce had returned home while Natalie and Liam were talking, and from the hallway he'd accidentally heard most of the conversation between mother and son. As he came into the room, he asked humorously, "So, this is how you educate your boy, huh?" Natalie hadn't expected him to be home so early and didn't know how much of the conversation he'd overheard. Embarrassed, she said, "I was only joking." He nodded and decided not to say any more. Her embarrassment somehow made him feel amused. When Liam saw Bryce, he ran to hug him, as if he hadn't seen him in a long time.
"Dad, you're home. I missed you a lot."
This intimate greeting from Liam already felt natural to Bryce somehow. He picked Liam up and asked in a very rare, gentle moment, "Are you hungry?"
Liam nodded and said, "I am really hungry. Mrs. Perkins said she'd cook me my favorite mac and cheese. but I wanted to wait for you to come home so we could eat together."
He looked at Bryce in anticipation, hoping he would eat with him. His eyes held a hint of longing. Bryce's heart softened when he looked at the boy. He suddenly realized that the boy must have longed for a father to sit down with for a long time. He smiled lovingly at Liam and said, "All right, kiddo, we'll eat together in a while." Natalie saw this gentle expression and was touched. Was this the same cold Bryce she'd known before? Mrs. Perkins came in. Seeing Bryce with Liam, she gave them a warmly affectionate look. She knew this father and son duo would definitely melt a lot of hearts wherever they went. Natalie was thinking the same thing. Somehow, since he got married, Bryce seemed to have matured into the fatherhood role a little. Mrs. Perkins, meanwhile, put the dishes on the dining table and called them to have dinner. When Natalie saw the table full of food, she felt humbled. There were lots of different dishes alongside Liam's mac and cheese. Fries, onion rings, salads, all sorts of things. It was like a banquet compared to what she was used to having. Liam's eyes lit up when he saw the food. He said sweetly to Mrs. Perkins,
"Wow, Mrs. Perkins, you're the best. This is great. You've made so much, and all of them are my favorite food."
Mrs. Perkins was beaming with joy. Her expression was affectionate. She said to him, "You're such a good boy. Eat up." Bryce said, "Mrs. Perkins, please come and eat with us." Mrs. Perkins had always been like a mother to him. When he was young, she looked after him most of the time, and she was considered not so much a maid or carer, but one of the family. She was a little hesitant to eat with them. Before Natalie had arrived here, she had often eaten with Bryce. But now that Natalie was Bryce's wife, and even though Natalie was easy to get along with, she didn't know whether Natalie would mind. Natalie saw her hesitation and guessed what she was worried about. Natalie, who didn't mind at all, said, "Mrs. Perkins, you've cooked so much food. We can't possibly finish all of these dishes without you. Please, come eat with us." Liam, clumsily but happily, carried a chair over for Mrs. Perkins, tottering comically under its weight. He called out anxiously,
"Mrs. Perkins, please come quickly. I can't hold on any longer."
She didn't hesitate anymore. She walked over to the dining table and sat down next to Liam to eat. From time to time while they were eating, Mrs. Perkins stole a look at Natalie from the corner of her eye. She finally felt at ease and thought, Mr. Bryce had found a good woman. She is sensible and doesn't act like a spoiled girl. She is far different from a lot of the rich women that have moved into the Clare family circle. As expected, Mr. Bryce has good taste. Bryce couldn't help but notice her admiring gaze on Natalie, and his expression became softer. Marrying this woman was quite a relief for him. It would save him a lot of problems. After dinner, Liam didn't bother his mother like he usually did, most likely because he was so happy. He played with his toys independently in the living room. Natalie, undisturbed, sat on the sofa, searching the web on her laptop. It seemed the likelihood of her staying at the company wasn't too high, so rather than wait for a disappointing outcome, she thought she might as well start looking for another job. Even though she had married Bryce, it was only a contract marriage, and this arrangement was only temporary. For many years, she had never relied on anyone to support her and Liam. She felt there was no reason to change her mindset. As Bryce walked past the living room, he saw Natalie engrossed in her laptop. He walked up behind her, looked at the laptop screen, and asked, "What are you doing?" Natalie, startled, turned around. She let out a long sigh. She said sadly, "I got a job offer a few days ago, but today I found out the company is restructuring. So I thought I should look for another job somewhere else."